Whether it is building a simple navigation bar or a pricing card, laying out elements in CSS can be a pain. But not if you get used to using Flexbox, which can be really useful if you want to lay out your elements either entirely horizontally or entirely vertically. In this video, I'll showcase how to use Flexbox from the ground up, along with actual examples so you know when and where to use what. To start, let's say we have 3 elements and we want to lay them out horizontally and ensure that they are centered as well. These elements can be anything: review cards or navigation links, for example. We will first start by selecting the parent container and changing the display property of it to flex to make it a flexbox, and this will be our flex container, and by default it will have a flex direction property of row, so all of our elements will be placed side by side in a single row. This is the default behavior, so even if we do not specify this, the flex direction is automatically set to being a row. We can also modify it to have a flex direction of column to place them on top of one another, but for now we will just use the default direction of row. To center our elements horizontally, we set the justify content property to center. The justify content property here allows us to modify the space distributed along the main axis. And the main axis is just a line that cuts through all of our elements, a horizontal one in this case, since our flex direction is set to row. Let's see a real-world example. Say you wanted to create this simple navigation bar with all 3 navigation links placed right in the center. And you can find all the necessary starter code within this GitHub link, which is in the description below as well. We can first start by selecting the parent element, which is the navigation bar. I will then go to the external style sheet here, where I've already added some initial styling so that we can focus on using flexboxes. And now we'll use the display flex property on the parent element class so that I can make it a flexbox. We then set this justify content property to center all of the elements within it to the center of the main axis. In this case it is horizontally. And this is sort of what we wanted, but it could use some spacing. And we can add some spacing between each individual item using the gap property, for example to 17 pixels. And feel free to try different values. This helps space the items out automatically instead of having to set the margin manually for each of the item. And hopefully you are starting to see why Flexbox is so powerful. It helps us make laying out elements, usually to center them, really easy to do. There are a few more values that the justify content property can have, so let's take a look at them. The one we looked at was the center value, which centers all elements to the middle of the parent. There is also flex start if we wanted to push everything to the start, and flex end if we wanted to push all of the elements to the end of the parent. These 2 values aren't used often, but the next few can be really useful. Instead of just spacing everything to the start, center, or to the end, we can also add different types of spacing, such as using space between, which spaces our items out evenly and ensures the first and end elements touches the ends. Or space evenly, which ensures the spacing between all elements are equal. And the last one is space around, which ensures the spacing between all elements are equal, but halfway spacing on both ends. And no, you don't need to remember them by heart. You can just experiment with the different values to find what works given different situations. Before we move on, try using the different values within the navigation bar example. And do note that I have added some padding, which is why flex start doesn't start right at the edge. Now previously we saw how to space out items along the main axis. But what if we wanted to instead change the spacing on the other axis, in this case vertically? For that we can use the align items property, and this helps to change the spacing on the cross axis, which goes in the opposite direction of the main axis. So imagine that each individual element here was given its own axis vertically, and we can then modify the spacing for each individual item. By default, it has the value of stretch, which forces it to take up as much space as possible, in this case vertically. Similar to justify content, we can also use flex start to push the elements towards the start of our parent container, as well as flex end to push them towards the end. There is also the option to center them using the center value. This is why when you want to center a div, you often see people use display flex, justify content set to center, and align items set to center a div within the document, since it centers everything on both axes. Something to note as well is that since each element has their own cross-axis, space around, space between, and space evenly are not possible values we can use for the align items property. The last possible value align items has its baseline, which is based on the content of our flex items. It takes the largest element, pushes it to the start, and uses its content as the baseline to align the rest of our flex items. But this is something that you rarely need to use. Let's take a look at another example. Say we wanted to create a simple component that showcases some feature to the user. We want to create this component that contains an icon, a heading, and a button. Within the HTML, we can see that we have a section with the features class name, and within that I have a feature container with the image, heading, and a button. Let's start by first centering the feature container to the center of the screen by selecting the features class and using display flex, justify content set to center, and align item set to center as well. But this doesn't exactly center the div, and if I add a background color to the section here, we can see that it's because there isn't sufficient height for it to be centered. So what I'll do is to give this section a minimum height of 100% of the viewport like so. Now that we have that centered, let's work on the feature container. Which we will also make a flexbox and give it a flex direction of column, so that its items go one on top of another. We will also want to space the elements out using the justify content property. You can play around with the different possible values for justify content, but from doing this before, I found space around to work pretty well here. And something to note here is that when we use a flex direction of column instead of row, the main axis and cross axis will swap positions, and this should follow our intuition, since the main axis must cut through all of our elements, and its direction is based on the flex direction. Coming back to our example, we have a few problems. For one, the button is stretched across the entire container, and if you remember, that's because the align items property is set to stretch by default, which forces all items to be stretched across the entire cross-axis. This is also the case for the heading if I add a background color to see the space it takes up. To fix that, we can specify its width of the flex items individually, or we can just set the align items property to center or one of the other possible values. I'll center it since I want all of the items here to be in the center horizontally. There's still some spacing within the button, but that's just because of the padding I've given it. And once again, I would highly encourage you to play around with the different values for align items and justify content to get a better feel for how it works. We can also nest flexboxes within one another to create more complex layouts. We have sort of already seen this by using a parent container to center our feature container using a flexbox, and then using another flexbox within the feature container. But this can be even more useful if we wanted to add multiple feature components to have 3 of them in a row, for example. I've also added 2 more icons here, which I'll quickly add to the image tags. By default, the flex direction is set to row, and this allows us to space our feature components horizontally. I'll separate them with a gap of 40 pixels as well. Right now, if the container is being shrunk, the items will shrink accordingly as well. But if we instead wanted the items to go to the next row if there is insufficient space, we can set the flex wrap property to wrap. So that way, if our items overflow out of the container, it will move to the next line. I've shown this here since you might see it being used, but in practice you'll rarely ever want to use flex wrap for such a scenario, since you usually want your items to either be entirely horizontal or entirely vertical. If you want to ensure that your website layout adjusts to different screen sizes by switching all items to be entirely vertical if the width is too small, we can do this by using a media query. So that way, if the device's width is too small to house all of our flex items, we simply change the flex direction to be a column. I'll remove the flex wrap and write the media query below, and we write it like so. Max width essentially means if the width is less than this value, in this case I've chosen 900 pixels, then we select our features section container and change its flex direction to column. And just within a few lines of CSS, we have ensured our layout responds accordingly to different screen sizes. So hopefully you're just as excited as me when I first found out how simple laying out elements can be. Just to quickly recap here, this is what we've done so far, and it will be what you use most often with Flexbox. You can space out the elements along the main axis within a Flexbox by using the justify content property, and the direction of the main axis is based on the flex direction of the Flexbox. We can also use the align items property to then space them out on the cross axis, which is opposite to the main axis. And lastly, we can use the flex direction to change the direction of our elements and the direction of our axes. There is also the flex wrap and the gap property to do more finer adjustments, like we have seen. Now that we've seen the basics, let's look at more advanced features that will give us more control when using Flexboxes. Currently, our flex items only take up as much space as they need. Even if there's extra space, they only take up the width and height that they are given. But what if we wanted to specify a proportion of the extra space the items should get? This can be really useful if we wanted to create a photo gallery, or just to ensure that we're making full use of the user's screen size. To do this, we can make use of the flex scroll property, which specifies the proportion of extra space the elements should receive relative to the other elements within the Flexbox. With the previous few properties we have looked at, we apply them to the parent container, but with the next few properties, we apply them instead to the individual children elements. For example, if we have two elements within our Flexbox and we select each of them and give them a flex scroll value of 1, they will both be allocated equal amounts of extra space if there are any extra space within the Flexbox. Note that I'm using the light blue box to indicate the extra space being given to both children elements. If we had instead given child A a flex scroll value of 1 and child B a flex scroll value of 2, then child B will always receive twice the extra space than child A if there are any extra space. And it is 1 over 3 and 2 over 3 here, since the total that the flex scroll values add to is 3. Just to further illustrate this example, if we give both children the same flex scroll value of 2, then they are still both allocated the same amount of extra space each. And that's because the way that the extra value is given is based on the proportion of the flex scroll value relative to the flex scroll value that the other elements in the Flexbox have. By default, the flex scroll value of any element will be 0. This means that it only takes up as much space as it needs to, and any extra space within the Flexbox will not be allocated to it. Another property that is sort of the opposite of flex scroll is flex shrink. Instead of specifying the proportion of extra space, we are specifying the relative proportion of space that the element should shrink by when the flexbox is given lesser space than what is needed. The default value for flex shrink for each of our elements is 1. This means that if the flexbox has insufficient space, it will shrink all of the elements within it equally. Another example here would be that if child A is given a flex shrink value of 1 and child B is given a flex shrink value of 2, then child B will shrink twice as much as child A when our flexbox has been shrunk. So we'll end up being smaller if the parent is being shrunk. Before I go over to the next example, I'll showcase one last property, and that is flexbases. This controls the initial width of our elements if our flex direction is set to row, and it will be the initial height if our flex direction is set to column. For example, we can set both of our child elements to have a flex basis of 200 pixels, which will be their initial width. If we were to give it a flex row value of 1 each, and if the parent container expands past 400 pixels, then the extra space will be distributed equally among both of the child elements. This is extremely similar to just setting the width using the width property within each of our child elements here. But the difference here is that if you change the flex direction to column, it will affect the height instead of the width. There is also another advantage, which is that you can use a shorthand property with flex bases, but we'll take a look at that later on. Now let's take a look at a quick example that involves using flex grow, shrink, and flex bases. And to do that, we'll work on creating this simple product page. This will involve nesting a flexbox within another flexbox. The first flexbox here will be a row to set the image and the product details side by side, and the second flexbox will be used to lay out the product details in a column. We will then use flex grow and flex shrink to allow both the image and the product details to use up any extra space and to shrink them in the correct proportions. So to start, I have the starting code here, which you can find in the same link below. For the structuring of our HTML, the main parent element for the product is this section with a class name of product, and within that I have a div for the image and another div for all of the product details. I'll first turn this parent product element into a flexbox, and it will have a flex direction of row by default, which is what we want so that the image and details can be placed side by side. I will also justify the content to be in the center and align the items to be in the center. This places everything within the center of our parent. Next, I'll turn the product description div into a flexbox with a flex direction of column so that the product details can be placed on top of one another. I will align the items to the start and justify the content to the center as well. We probably also want to add a gap of about 25 pixels. If you are unsure of how these values affect our layout, try using different values or rewatching the part of this video when I introduced them earlier on. I'll give the image a flex basis of 1000 pixels and the product description a flex basis of 500 pixels. This will set their initial width, and feel free to play around with using different values as well. For the image, I will give it a minimum width of 400 pixels so that it doesn't shrink all the way down. This is not a good idea if we want this website to work well on a mobile device, but in this case we are just creating this to view it on a desktop. Now that we have set the basic layout, if there is any extra space, I want the image to always receive twice as much the space as the product description. To do that, I'll give the image a flex grow of 2 and the product description a flex grow of 1. This will allow our elements to take up any extra space as needed, but still remain in the proportions that we want them to. Similarly, if the elements were to shrink past the initial width, I want the product details to shrink twice as fast as the image, so that the image will always have more space. To do that, we'll give the product details a flex shrink of 2 and the image a flex shrink of 1. And now we have successfully laid out the elements like we initially wanted them to look like. Since flex growth, flex basis, and flex shrink are commonly used together within our child elements, you might also see them written this way, and this simply refers to the first value being the flex growth value, in this case 1, the second value being the flex shrink value, in this case 0, and the last value being the flex basis value, in this case 100 pixels. It is entirely up to personal preference whether you choose to use this shorthand, but it's still good to know in case you come across it. There are a few other ways to write this, and more shorthands for it, but I'll leave it at this. Finally, the last property I will showcase is the align self property. If you recall back to when we first used the align items property, we can space our items to the center start or by the baseline of the content of our flex items based on the cross-axis, as well as to stretch them. But when we, for example, align all of our items to the flex start, it affects all of the items. But what if we instead wanted to only change the alignment of just one child item? For that, we can use the align self property. For example, if we use the align items on the parent to push all of our flex items along the cross-axis to the start, but we want child A to be pushed to the center and the rest to remain at the start, we can use the align self property on child A and set it to center. The possible values the align self property can have is therefore also the same as all the possible values the align items property can have. Align self is something I find myself using quite often, and it can be really useful. To show you a quick example with our previous product page example, within the product description column, we have set the align items property to flex start so that all of the items are pushed to the left hand side. If we just wanted the button to be placed in the center, we can use the align self property on the button and set it to the center. Another common use case of align self is within a pricing component to make the per month tag appear below the price. It doesn't make sense to do it here, but I'll just showcase it as an example. To do this, we place it in a spend tag. I'll give it a class name of per month to be able to select it separately in our style sheet. We place it in a span here and not a div, because if we place it within a div, it will take up the entire row due to its display property. So if I select the product price class now and make it a flexbox, it will by default be a row. I will also align all the items to the center, and we don't see any effects here on our document, but if I select the per month class and set the align self property to flex end, then that will be pushed to the bottom vertically. It still doesn't look like anything has taken place here, and that's because they are of the same font size. But if I change the font size of the tag within the per month class to be something like 1.1 rem, which is lower than the 2.2 rem of the price, we can see that we have the desired result. And if this is your first time coming across rem, so 1 rem simply means 16 pixels, there are a few advantages to using rem instead of pixels, which is why I'm using it here. So here's just a quick recap of all of the different advanced properties that are applied directly on the Flexbox items that we learned. Flex grow allows us to assign a proportion of the extra space to our flex items relative to other items. Flex shrink allows us to assign a proportion of how much a flex item should shrink by, if necessary, relative to the other items. Flex basis is the initial width if the flex direction of the parent is set to row, or the initial height if the flex direction of the parent is set to column. And finally, align self sets the individual flex items alignment on the cross-axis. Now, you might not be entirely comfortable with all of the Flexbox properties we have learned so far, and that's perfectly fine. One way to get much better quicker is to practice, so I've created a few challenges if you would like to put your skills to the test. And if you're unsure of any Flexbox properties, feel free to go back to that part of the video to rewatch my explanation on it. The first challenge is to create a simple component that showcases different holiday ideas. This is extremely similar to the feature component that we have created previously, so see if you can recreate this time around. I've added the necessary starter code and styling to get you started, so you just need to work on adding the Flexboxes and using the right properties within the different classes. You can find all of the code and images within the GitHub link in the description, and I've left a few hints if you're unsure of how to get started. Feel free to also change up the colors, images, or content. The next challenge is to create this homepage design. Once again, I've added the necessary images, HTML code, and the styling, but you need to figure out where and how to add the Flexboxes. This will require more tinkering around to get it to look similar to the design I have here, but that's definitely possible. As always, you can change up the styling and play around with the design to make it yours. Besides that, that is all for this video. This video took a long time to create. If you have found it useful or helpful, please consider possibly liking it and subscribing to my channel to help me create more such content.